communication. And I think that is key. I think I'm hoping that one thing you're going to see in Vietnam is because the incidence of streaming piracy is so high, and because now you're seeing from pirate sites, because now you're seeing such a high level of blocking, that's actually one of the best forms of communication and messaging. When people go to a pirate site but it's blocked, that sends the message it's wrong. So what we see in a lot of other countries is, well, you go to the pirate site, it's not blocked, well, it must be okay. So hopefully it's not an explicit form, it's not a communications campaign, but it's actually very effective. And again, like I said, I'm really looking forward to seeing the effect of the increase in blocking in Vietnam and see how that will be reflected in our annual consumer surveys as well. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Louis. Thank you, Thomas. So the next session, we're going to be sort of picking up on a lot of what was just spoken about, and in particular, we're going to be talking about technology. Prior to this job, one of my members actually at the Coalition Against Piracy and AVIA is Premier League. Prior to this job, I was working at the Premier League, and when I was there, we were told about this almost mythical company called Friend MTS, and this unfathomable technology that, in particular in the UK, which was highly effective in blocking, truly highly effective in blocking. And one of my jobs at the Premier League was to sort of go around the region and sort of preach the benefits of high-level automated blocking, which is what sort of Thomas was talking about as a necessary next step. And fortunately, we've got Robin Boldon, who's the head of product for Friend MTS, who's flown all the way out from England today. And I think it's super timely, actually, that you're with us today, Robin, because as Thomas was talking about, I think the next step is to try and move towards an automated solution. So, Robin, if you could come up, and we're going to be talking through, Robin will be talking through in a little bit more detail what this mythical company, Friend MTS, do, and then we'll talk in a little bit more detail as well about sort of some of the stuff that you're doing and maybe how it could apply to Vietnam.
Good afternoon, everybody. Really fantastic to be here today and share with you some thoughts around blocking around the world and also how it relates to this region in particular. So what I thought I'd do is just give you 60 seconds, well, a couple of minutes on who we are and what we do, and then we'll talk in a bit more detail about that. So as a company, we've been around for about 20 years. We spend a lot of time working with rights holders and platforms, looking at the problem of live content protection, live piracy, and the particular unique challenges that presents. In particular, we've spent the last 8 years developing and really pioneering the idea of being able to block in real time access to pirated live streams of high-value premium content. We've built the solution that we will talk a little bit about today from the ground up. So it's completely based around the requirements of our customers, and the technology is configurable in a variety of different services to meet the demands of each platform. The other final thing to mention here is we have something called a piracy source register, which is our collection of intelligence gathered over that period of time. And it evolves on a daily basis where we learn new techniques the pirates are deploying to evade detection and how we can then capture that information to be able to do something about it and spot that pattern when it reappears. So just to give you a very quick snapshot of the kind of work we're doing right now, we're in a very, very lucky position to be trusted with around $60 billion worth of media rights that we look after on behalf of our customers to protect those around the world. It means that we monitor nearly 6,000 hours of content every week on behalf of those customers. And we're processing years worth of video every day in order to determine what is pirated and, more importantly, what we can do about it.
Yeah, our systems capture and process nearly 3 years worth of content every day.
Yes, so that's equivalent to around 28,000 hours a day. Yeah, so you couldn't watch it all.
No, you couldn't. One thing I forgot to ask you is, are you a sports fan?
I try not to be. I spend every day watching it, so...
You got to be impartial, don't you?
Yeah, well, my father was a Grimsby Town fan, which means I didn't have much chance when it comes to a good team, but...
Interesting. Well, thanks. And as I said, and I genuinely meant it, I mean, Friend have a high-class reputation And I think we're going to go into a little bit of that later on in terms of how you've cut that reputation around the world. It was certainly something that began with Jonathan in the United Kingdom in particular. But what we're dealing with here is a regional problem, and also sort of on a global problem which is localized. So can you sort of talk us through a little bit more together about? We've had Thomas up before here. You're talking from sort of a global perspective. Later on, we'll be talking about that a little bit more. How does it all fit together?
That's a really good question. So, I mean, our customers span a broad spectrum of rights holders, platforms, and they all have a slightly different take on how to solve that problem in their particular market. So we very much deal with this on a modular basis. And just to give you an idea of this last summer, the kind of scale, when we aggregate all of those customers together, that gives us a unique insight in terms of the behavior of those pirates and how they tend to operate in their different markets. So for us, there are three key disciplines that we look at this problem with. We monitor the landscape, both from a global perspective, I think, which was touched on earlier, but also understanding the specific nuances within a region and the specific requirements there. The next element is around we've got to be very accurate in our identification of the content. There are millions of hours worth of content out there, lots of very valuable and entertaining content, but we need to be very, very clear on what we're looking for. And then the third element is around what do we do about it? We found it, we've proven that it is the content we're interested in, what are we then going to do about it?
Before we move on, I think this is a really important point. You've spoken before about you've got to be really clear about what the content is. But why? What are some of the downsides if you get the content wrong?
I think one of the key challenges that we've faced as an industry is it's often seen as it's a very simple problem. It's a scale problem. You just have to issue billions of notices and it's all fine. But we know that that's a very blunt instrument. And in fact, it causes more damage than good if it's not done properly. And so the safety aspect, the trust aspect is absolutely essential to be able to convince people that more innovative means to solve this problem are justifiable.
I think it's really important because, as Thomas was talking before, in Vietnam, for example, it's really important to not only have the ISPs, the telecommunication companies board of, but the government also board of, and everyone has their necks on the line when that happens. If something goes wrong, we have seen in the last sort of 12 months or so, then everyone's going to be pointing at, well, hang on, you allowed this to happen.
Yeah, so I should stress that it wasn't the example you're talking about wasn't one of ours, but you're absolutely right. When it's not done with that sense of proportionality and targeting, then it can be ineffective and can cause more damage. Perhaps one of the things to sort of swip onto here is we certainly see blocking in kind of two core areas. And the reason we address it that way is domain blocking is really, really important because it addresses the access points of piracy. And we're looking in particular at the public-facing manifestations of those sites, often the front doors that consumers will access to get hold of that content. So being able to block access to those, suppress access to those signposts, you are really moving forward to pushing a subset of some of the target audience that you talked about back to legitimate platforms. And the other aspect of this is what we call dynamic server blocking, which is the next evolution of that blocking concept. And it really looks at the underlying delivery infrastructure and says there's another degree to which we can really disrupt and affect the pirates' organization.
The way that it was described to me back in the day is domain name server blocking was essentially looking at websites. That's kind of what you were trying. A website has a domain, and most blocking in the region is done through DNS, domain name server blocking, where essentially the ISP removes the domain from its internal library, and that's really effective when it comes to just blocking websites. But as you move away from just trying to block websites, and in particular you move to servers, and the servers that are providing the content to maybe the websites, maybe to the ISDs or whatever, that's when you need the IP address blocking.
Absolutely. The other aspect I'd say here is, whereas domain blocking can be somewhat persistent, dynamic server blocking we recommend is always done on an event basis. because you want to keep the subject of that block on their toes in terms of where you're going to strike next. And as they change their delivery infrastructure, you are ready to change and pivot to where they've gone to.
Yeah, so like the domain is permanently removed, but if it's an IP block, it's generally just during the game, isn't it?
That's correct. The other thing to point out here is with IP addresses, there are some services that are called multi-tenanted, and that means more than one service can use the same IP address. A good example of that in our industry would be Cloudflare, which is a known problem for a lot of reasons. And that's where, by combining these services together, you actually get the ability to do something about the Cloudflare problem in some of those situations.
Well, let's hope so.
So the other thing that I think is probably worth just touching on is how we look at blocking as a strategy. And I appreciate this is quite a busy slide, but what this is designed to show is there are multiple starting points on your journey to implementing a blocking solution. You might start on the left-hand side here, really talking about domain blocking. Equally, you might choose to start further along the life cycle around dynamic server blocking and then having both. And the whole idea is that it drives the long-term efficacy of that capability, and it's aligned very much to the legal framework in a region, the regulatory environment.
And I think as you go more left to right, the need for automation comes in.
Absolutely. I think as you reveal more piracy in a region, and you reveal that it is relevant to that particular event or piece of content, your scalability is absolutely essential to be able to maintain the pace. So I think what we're really talking about here is that evolution, and you touched on it in your introduction earlier. And as I said, the two techniques work best together, and it allows better efficacy and durability. And I think something that we would all recognize is it's one thing to start and implement a blocking capability, but it needs to have a long-term viability to be baked into legislation of a country or in the regulatory environment. So we need to make sure that it has a sustainability as well.
I think one thing which is really interesting on this as well is the different forms of blocking in what we've got in Asia Pacific. And on the one hand, you've got judicial, which is what you've got in the UK, and really that's just Australia and Singapore, and it's essentially DNS site blocking, which is all that's happening. Potentially capability, although Singapore not really sure, to move to the level of automation for IP server level blocking. But most other countries around the region, it's regulatory. And what's really interesting in Vietnam is what regulatory means is you're at the hands of the government.
Yep.
You can't go to a court and then the ISPs are compelled. You sort of have to ask for a favour to an extent, or for the good graces from the government. And fortunately in Vietnam, it looks like it's happening, and it was happening or is happening in Indonesia. But I think there are different challenges with both. When it's regulatory, it's harder to get the high level of blocking that you need. Although, as I said, I think that is starting to happen.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's being respectful of the particular needs of individual regulators and environments, and the approach can be very different. We always take a very collaborative approach in terms of the outcomes that our customers are trying to achieve, but also understanding the way in which particular markets function. So we talk an example about a case study.
We did talk about a case study, yeah. So we've got a blocking program in place. We've talked about a little bit about this already. But how do you ensure that it maintains momentum and continues to deliver the efficiency that you're looking for?
It's a really good example, and thank you for taking up the case study here, which is really interesting. And this is for a Canadian broadcaster, and their problem in particular was around significant problems with piracy for their premium content, live sports in particular, but also other kinds of content I'll come on to in a moment. And their linear channels and the live content were predominantly being exploited. And so we were asked to kind of offer, first of all, an initial insight on the scale of the problem, to enable them to really define the scope of the outcome that they were looking to achieve. And that's really essential, I think, to have a good baseline of the piracy problem, and also what are the realistic things you can do to address those. We also included a particular aspect of piracy, which is the subscription services that use IPTV. So you mentioned ISDs and other streaming devices, those that come with a subscription that you pay to the pirate.
Yeah.
And there was a particular problem in that territory. So we were able to find evidence for that, and that.
So you landscaped as part of the problem. You landscaped.
Yeah, part of the problem, we were able to landscape that, but also then build up that body of evidence on an ongoing basis that supports the ultimate blocking implementation that we put in place. And it resulted in, for a given event, we'd block, in this case, up to 1,700 servers, and that can represent a significant impact on the overall traffic that relates to that.
That's interesting, yeah, because you look at 1,700 and you're like, well, that's not much. But that's service. It's not sites, is it?
That's right. So
could you extrapolate that into some other numbers?
Yeah. So what you can do is you can look at the traffic that relates to, and you can see the difference between an event period and a non-event period, and that tells you very clearly the impact that you have. And then when you overlay the intelligence around the type of subscriptions that those services have, or if they are open web, the kind of traffic that might be driven to those domains, it allows you to build up that picture of the impact on that.
And how many of those this was a Canadian, how many of those servers were based in Canada?
So some of the access points were based locally in the domestic market, but what we found predominantly, because of the type of content from both the US and Europe into that region, the sources were coming from outside of the region, because the pirate will always choose the path of least resistance. If they get access to content elsewhere, they will.
But for the purposes of blocking, it doesn't matter.
Exactly, it doesn't matter. In this example, you can show that they are available in that territory, and that passes that test.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big misconceptions, or not misconceptions, misunderstandings about piracy, is that you're blocking a site which originates in the country or a server which originates in the country. But actually, that's the beauty of blocking, is that you're blocking sites or services that you would not normally be able to take any form of action against because they're outside. Slightly different to what we've got in Vietnam, Indonesia, and Thailand, because as I mentioned before, most of the ecosystem is largely because it's language-based, is locally homegrown. But the solution will work both ways.
That's right. In fact, what we found is that as more effective use of this kind of blocking technique in this specific region, other rights holders wanted to take part in it, other platforms wanted to take part. So I think the point that was raised earlier about collaboration, that was a really good one that sort of came through in this market. And so now the current iteration of blocking includes a portfolio of rights holders and their content and the licensed platforms.
But it was started by one?
Started by one.
Was it one broadcaster with one primary form of content?
Yes.
Oh, thanks. Well, okay, we've sort of spoken a little bit about one country or one example, and can you tell and sort of touched upon how it expanded? But can you give us an example of where, in a territory, a strategy has evolved?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a European example, but I think it illustrates how it can be developed over time. So this is a pay TV and a telco combined. They invest heavily in live premium content, but also they've got a broad variety of on-demand premium content, movies and so on. So, as I said, we take this on a very modular basis, and the first thing is to define the scale of the problem, both in terms of the global export of that content, but also the regional impact, and that's really important to capture how local access points are being used. So whether that be local websites, local services, what different, we call vectors of piracy, different forms of piracy are being used to promote and access that content. And then implementing a combination, so both domain and dynamic server blocking for their content. And that allows them to really see two things. One, to ensure that they have good security hygiene in their own organization, so they can see where there's any leaks happening and they can do something about it. But also, as they're licensing that content to other syndicated partners, they can put a very clear requirement on their reuse.
Yeah, I mean the protection of the content that broadcasters are paying for is actually becoming increasingly important, because I know that some rights holders are saying, well, look, if we're going to give you this, you've got to make sure that you're protecting it. Because if you're not protecting it very well, and then it's leaked or it's pirated, and it goes and impacts not necessarily just your country, but other jurisdictions, then you're going to have to pay a price.
Absolutely. And it's all about gathering the data. The data signals tell us what's happening and where that content is being sourced from. And then that informs those business conversations in a more objective way.
And the solution that you're proposing, is it all in-house? All provided by...
That's correct.
By Friend?
Yes, it is.
Is it all run out? I mean, you've come out from the UK. Is it all run out of the UK, or you're a global business? To what extent are the operations, the landscaping, the provision of the solutions, is it run out of the UK, or is it run from national?
So we have an international footprint for our services, so we can locate our monitoring, for example, in whatever region we need to, both from a technical perspective, but also from an intelligence and research and information gathering perspective. We have a presence in Asia, in Singapore, and that allows us to be very responsive to the local need, as well as the global picture. And as I said earlier, there is a distinct advantage to being able to have visibility on both of those aspects.
Yeah. And what about language? Because I can remember, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, sitting in a cafe in Hong Kong with Jonathan Friend, and we were talking about the problems or the issue of, at the time, China, and the growth of piracy in China, and there was a big deal that was just being done in China then. It fell over, but at the time no one was going to know that. And we were talking about the difficulties of trying to landscape, monitor, and provide solutions to piracy in different languages. Is that much of an issue for you guys? How do you overcome that?
So two elements there. There's a human element to understanding the local demand, how content is accessed. And we touched on social media in a previous session, and that's a really good indicator of the terminology that people use, the local terms, languages, and so on, of how piracy is described.
And so part of your landscaping solution is to
understand, to understand that. The other element is then the network observations, and thankfully there are some universals to that in terms of the fundamentals of networking technology and how the internet functions. So it's combining those two elements together that allows us to be effective in each market.
Okay, and you've talked here about domain and dynamic server level blocking, and how they work together to address more complex problems. How does that work in practice?
So I think one of the things that we are really keen to ensure is that there's a need to calibrate the service for each individual set of circumstances. And so it's not one solution that works everywhere in the same configuration.
All right. Yeah, so sort of coming back to it again, what we've got, I think, in all countries around the region is essentially DNS blocking. Now, I know that in Korea they're doing some kind of funky IP level blocking, but no one really understands what's going on there because it's all through the government. And I know that in Indonesia, they are doing IP blocking, but it's IP blocking of websites only. It's not yet at server level. But interestingly, it's government blocking. So it's regulatory blocking of IP services. And I was closely involved in that. And the interesting thing about that was we were trying to avoid that danger of overblocking. I think that the difference there, though, was in when people talk about IP blocking and they're concerned about overblocking, I think it's more because of the servers. And like you said, they can be multi-services, and a bunch of different clients can be on the IP on the server. And so if you block that server, you might block piracy.com, but also HSBC.com. Whereas I think in Indonesia, because it's just IP address level of the domains, it's not that much of an issue.
Yeah, I think that kind of multifaceted point there, and it touches on the safety aspect and also the tests that you do to be sure that a target is valid for blocking. And there are certain tests and techniques that you undertake to ensure that you stick to the requirements and the regulation, and you you'd always err on the caution, of not blocking something than over blocking.
And are those tests, because I think, I'm not sure about the Canadian example, but I presume it's the same as the UK example, that blocks that were put in place were through a court order?
Those examples were, yes. There are others where we work with a regulator rather than...
Okay. So in a court, I know that you'd have to give evidence of safeguards that are in place, that there would be no over-blocking. You have to satisfy the court to a high level, such that the court is comfortable issuing the order. How do you go about doing it with government?
So typically, you're right. In some jurisdictions, the tests are agreed in advance, and you prove that you've met those tests. It's more of an automated process to then establish the blocking as it happens. With regulatory environment where there may well be a review that needs to happen, what we would do is we would package that evidence, and it's delivered maybe via a portal or some other mechanism that's agreed with the regulator. They may have their own infrastructure that they want you to deliver your evidence into, and then there's a review process that happens for publication.
On a very simple level, going back to Indonesia, because it's the only country where we've done a form of IP level blocking, the way that we did it was we ran a test or a trial for 3 months where we blocked a limited amount, or we gave them a limited amount of IP addresses, and then we monitored them on a daily basis, reporting back if any of the IPs had jumped, the owner or the operator had changed hands, and it never had, because they were all basically these. We've missed out the Torrent Freak slide. I don't know.
That's we can go back. I think we can go back that one. That one.
Yeah. So I think this is really, really important, because I think there's a high level of nervousness about over-blocking and IP blocking, server-level blocking. And just coming back again to the Indonesia example, we've now blocked about 3,000 IP addresses in Indonesia, not a single overblock or wrong block. And we've blocked in total about 7,000 IP and DNS. How many? I mean, this 4,500, it looks like a low number.
It does. This is just in a 90-day period, 3 months.
So in 3 months, you blocked 4,500 domains and subdomains. Is that the IP servers, or
that could be access points, so front-end domains as well.
Okay, yeah, 4,500 blocked. No issues.
No issues.
Have you had issues?
We've never had an issue where we've overblocked.
Yeah, never. In 8 years now?
No. And that's really important, because to be able to, as they build that trust and that credibility, it's really important to say we'd rather say we haven't blocked this item because we're not quite sure, or there's a question, than overblock it and then find, as other jurisdictions and other people have, that then causes a whole knock-on effect of the efficacy of the overall proposition.
Yeah, it's absolutely crucial. I think it's also really interesting about, you and I were talking about this before, that this is Torrent Freak. So Torrent Freak is kind of notorious. It started historically as kind of being, piracy's good and copyright protections are too strong and too rigid. But I think Torrent Freak over the years has sort of become more balanced, and you get stuff like this, where they're standing behind effectively and standing up for the level of blocking.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I think it's testament to the partnership that we create with customers and the legal environment. We've learned a lot about the law in the same way that our partners in law have learned a lot about the technology of the internet, and they've learned a lot about how pirates behave and what they'll do to try and evade detection.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. We're sort of running a little bit out of time. Are there any questions here? Robin, does anyone have any questions? No? Okay, well, if you're a sports fan, we could talk about sports, but clearly you're not. I don't know enough about Grimsby Town to ask you about.
They weren't doing so good this year.
Yeah. No, who was it? Wrexham that was there? It was Wrexham, the famous one. Okay, look, if we were to sort of conclude here, we've just got a couple of minutes to go. You've brought your experience out, internationally, but you're based in the UK. You've heard a little bit about what Boldon's been talking about, and I've given a sort of an overview of piracy around the region and in particular in Vietnam. If you were to sort of give some advice or give some suggestions for how rights holders in APAC and in Vietnam in particular could look to best protect their content, what would that be?
I think collaboration is absolutely key, and Lewis mentioned it right at the very beginning. It's not an isolated problem that only one element of our ecosystem can deal with. we always describe piracy as your biggest competitor because they are extremely well funded.
You can't compete with free.
Unencumbered by the rules and the regulations and commercial relationships. And actually seeing your adversary in that way allows you to address the problem as if they were a competitor.
Yeah, I agree with you. That collaboration aspect is really important. I mean, in some countries, we've had to bring industry, ISPs in particular, sort of kicking and screaming to the table via a court order or a government regulatory order. I think, as Thomas was mentioning before, as ISPs and telecommunication companies are getting into the business of content production as well, and that can be a real value add to an underlying telecommunications company. I think that's really, really important. But what I think is really encouraging in Vietnam, and we saw it in Indonesia as well, is the level of buy-in from government, because you kind of can't do it without government if there's no core processes.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're always very open about how we can collaborate to help move things forward. We see the problem very clearly and writ large, but you have to address it at the right pace.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look, thanks, Robert. I think it's such a timely talk, and where we are at the moment. I mean, once again, as Thomas was saying, the need, I think, to move to automation in Vietnam and actually in a lot of countries, because what we're seeing is the move away from sort of a static pirate operation to very agile operations. Block them there, you hit them there, and they just move around within minutes, if not less. So I think it's really, really timely and really important. We've got you out here there is a solution to this problem. So thank you, Phil. Thank you, Robin. Okay, thank you. Shit, that's good. Bye.